Is Utah close to landing a transfer quarterback? Meanwhile, a elite defensive back from the University of Utah just entered the transfer portal. And does BYU landing AJ Dybantsa show the growing gap between BYU and Utah outside of just basketball? We're talking about it all on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen and view of the day. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, available wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. If you're first time listening to our show, make sure you like and subscribe. Love interacting with all of you in YouTube comments, as well as on social media. We can follow our show at Locked On Utes on X. And today's episode of our show is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is the place you can start the season with a big return at, because new customers can place a $5 bet and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. You can visit FanDuel.com to get started. My name is JT Wistersill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department, and we have a loaded show today. I mean, the offseason is almost becoming crazier than the season. I don't know how off the rails this season went, but my gosh, I'm talking, I'll try to have an episode planned out earlier in the day. Like, this is what we'll talk about. This is what we'll talk about. And all of the topics will get thrown out the window because of the craziness that keeps happening. There's a lot of places we can start. BYU landing Dybantsa. What does that mean? Cameron Calhoun's transfer. We'll talk about that here in a second. But I think the biggest thing right now for Utah is the most important position on the field, and that's quarterback. And Utah might be close to landing a transfer portal quarterback. Jason Beck came from New Mexico. New Mexico had the fourth best offense in the country. Part of the reason for that was Jason Beck. Another part of it was Devon Dampier. Dampier, the quarterback, entered the portal as well. And he tweeted out that he found a new home, ... Stay tuned. Well, a lot of Utah players, Darren Zipper, did the eye emoji. A lot of reporters and insiders also say, putting the eye emoji up on an On3 expert even earlier today, locked in his prediction for a school for where he thought Dampier was going to end up. So Utah is obviously right up to the top, if not the favorite, one of the favorites for Dampier. And this would be incredibly exciting to me, right? I talked about it a few weeks ago. I don't think he's the number one player Utah should go after. I talked about Miller Moss and some of my excitement there, just from the standpoint of one guy's done it on the power forward level versus Dampier. I think he can do it on the power forward level. We just haven't seen him do it there yet. But I do think this would be a really good get for Utah if they're able to land Dampier. Look at last season, had 2,768 passing yards, 12 touchdowns. And I know the 12 interceptions is something that you might be like, ugh, but 19 rushing touchdowns to offset that, including 6 in his final 2 games. Did it against really good teams too, right? I mean, you look at, he was able to beat Washington State last year, and he was great in the Washington State game. Had 174 passing yards, 193 rushing yards, accounted for 4 total touchdowns, and no turnovers against the best team he played too. Also, still has 2 years left of eligibility too, so still a young player who's only grown and got better. And he's a guy that I think can make special plays, especially with his legs. He's incredibly challenging to tackle. What he unlocks in the quarterback run game, and that's one of the toughest things the defense can try to do, is stop a running quarterback, because you look at what a quarterback can do with their legs. You can have everything accounted for as a defense. Okay, no one's open downfield, but what happens on third and long? Oh, the quarterback made our spy linebacker miss, and now he's off and running for 30 yards. So that's the kind of problems and threats that Dampier can decimate a team with. And also, once again, fourth best offense in the country last year in terms of total yards, led by, or yards per game, Devon Dampier. That is incredibly exciting. I mean, how can you not be fired up if this is the guy that Utah was to land? And I think there's a lot of reason to think this will be Utah, right? He obviously got the Utah offer early on. Jason Beck and him have a really strong rapport, Utah's new offensive coordinator, and he knows how to get the best out of Dampier. There's a reason Dampier's been well sought after. I think this is a logical next step for him to come to Utah. I hope that Utah is able to land a quarterback, because the portal, there's still good players out there. Portal's always full of craziness, madness, and everything too. So we'll see what all ends up shaking out from this if Utah isn't the team that Dampier is going to go to. But that definitely seems like the most likely option right now. And once again, would be incredibly fired up to land Dampier, because I do think Utah can win the Big 12 with Dampier's skill set. He's an improving passer who's already one of the best running quarterbacks in college football last season. And we know Utah, with Kyle Whittingham as your head coach, is still going to want to run the ball a lot. So having a dynamic runner at quarterback is going to be, and who's still capable of making throws and plays downfield is something that excites me too. So I really do hope that Utah is the team that Dampier is talking about when he says found a new home. I feel like they're the most likely and the favorite at this point for sure. And it does seem like that's how it's trending. So fingers crossed it will finish through. And unfortunately, while we might be gaining Dampier, Utah's losing Cameron Calhoun, and that is really tough, or I should say more than likely losing. He's in the transfer portal, he announced, which definitely came as a surprise to everyone. Several Utah football players even quote tweeting it and just their reactions and surprises. Just a few days ago, Calhoun tweeted out, or I think it was last week, a Utah man am I, like just, like saying like, hey, I'm locked in. That's what all these guys kind of do. They're going to stay is they tweet out about their support for the school and that they're going to stay. And even a couple days ago, he was recruiting someone to come to Utah. And now all of a sudden he's in a portal. And it doesn't make sense. Unfortunately, though, when you look at what's happening in college football, it starts to make more sense, right? I think Sean O'Connell of ESPN 700 said it best. This is what he tweeted out on his X account. Knew he was going to get big offers. Utah will increase their bid to keep him. Maybe a leverage play, ? That's the key right there. He was going to get big offers. How about another Utah insider? Steve Bartle, KSL Sports, said, all it takes is an offer or two from another school, and any sort of previous agreement is out the window. Do not envy college staffs. This is madness. And our friend Alex Markham retweeted the same thing and said this exactly. So it seems very likely that what happened was Calhoun was given high NIL offers, and at the moment, more than Utah was either did or is willing to do. Utah could lose Cameron Calhoun. There are other players who have entered the portal. I was actually at a huge portal thing I wanted to do. Maybe we'll have time to get to it about all the guys that Utah have entered the portal outside the QBs and talk about their losses and everything. But most of the players that Utah lost had been backups or not like key star players. I think the biggest loss of the portal before Calhoun, in my opinion, was what they were losing in Carson Ryan, who I thought was going to be the team's starting tight end. But even when Carson Ryan leaves, you still get Landon King back. So you're like, okay, we still have a starting tight end there. And obviously Utah still has good defensive backs. I mean, at the moment, still right, Elijah Davis, Kenan Johnson, and Smith Snowden. That's still a good defensive backfield. But I did feel like the best cornerback on Utah's roster was Cameron Calhoun. Maybe Smith Snowden. That's a narrow gap between those two guys. But this hurts to lose Calhoun. This is the biggest loss in the transfer portal right now. And unfortunately, it's just the era we're in, where I think the Colorado State coach, I was just listening to something where he's talking about how these players aren't even being contacted by the teams. What's happening is you have agents. And I'm not saying this is what happened to Cameron Calhoun. We don't know, but this is what the coach at Colorado State, Coach Norvell, said, that what happens is these agents contact the players and say, oh, I can get you an NIL deal of this much. And then it's not the programs like the other schools reaching out and bringing that player in. It's the agents acting as the middleman. And that's really unfortunate. And it just really sucks that Utah could be losing out. And more than likely, anytime you enter the portal, I think it's more than likely the guy leaves, losing out on Calhoun, one of their best players from this past season, one of their brightest spots. He had led the team in defensive pass breakups and didn't even play in the very first game and was battling an injury, but then came back and was fantastic. So, I mean, he's a great player. Or I should say he's a really good player, has a chance to be a great player. And if that's not at Utah, that really hurts. And gosh, leaving Sharif Shaw too as your defensive back coach, that's just another wild thing. Like that's just, it's today's era of college football, right? It seems like it's NIL related when the reports come out. So yeah, it's a tough one for Utah that they're missing out on Calhoun, but hopefully they'll land Devon Dampier by the time you're maybe even listening to this tomorrow. So it'll be something we'll be keeping an eye on this show as the portal stays absolutely crazy. And obviously part of the portal is recruiting. You have to do that a lot. Well, BYU just landed a monster recruit in the number one basketball player in the country in AJ Dybantsa, excuse me. What does that doesn't just mean something for the hardwood. I think that means something for when you look at what's going on between Utah's athletics and BYU athletics. We're going to talk about those two programs in one moment. But first, today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by our friends at Omaha Steaks. Are you looking for the perfect gift this holiday season? And you know what? I know I am too. So What's the best gift you can get someone? Well, I'm a former offensive lineman, so can't go wrong with a good old steak. I will say high school offensive lineman. Don't want to make anyone think anything I was too crazy, but nothing delivers the comfort and quality and joy quite like the unrivaled taste of Omaha Steaks. It's guaranteed perfection in every single bite. And right now you can save an unforgettable gift from 50% off site-wide at omahasteaks.com. Plus score an extra $30 off with promo code college, all caps, no spaces. With 5 generations of experience, they constantly deliver the world's best steak experience, and gifting experts at Omaha Steak have made it easy to deliver the perfect gift with thoughtfully curated gift packages featuring gourmet favorites from legendary steaks to mouth-watering desserts and more. You can save 50% off site-wide for limited time at omahasteaks.com. Plus, our listeners get an extra $30 off with promo code college. That's 50% off at omahasteaks.com. An extra $30 off with that promo code college. Minimum purchase may apply. Head over and get yourself a good old-fashioned Omaha steak today. All right, keeping it rolling. BYU made quite the waves. Well, and I guess this was heavily reported last night, but officially on First Take earlier today, AJ Dybantsa announced that he is going to be playing at BYU for head coach Kevin Young. And that's the number 1 player in all of college basketball. And yes, this obviously is about the growing gap between BYU and Utah basketball. If BYU is landing the top player in the nation and Utah is not able to land anything close to that. I like the players on Utah's roster, but they're not. Utah hasn't sniffed the number 1 player in the class. But this says something more than about the hardwood. This says something about where BYU athletics are and where Utah athletics are. And unfortunately, I shouldn't even be using the word athletics. The word is NIL and collectives. Reports were that Dybantsa's asking price were $7 million. And there was a report that came out that BYU estimated the report that came out was On3 reported that Dybantsa could net upwards of $4 to $4.5 million from BYU. So what exactly he got, we don't know. Even what's reported, like if someone says, he got $4 million, like we don't, those numbers, even those can sometimes be wrong. So we don't know exactly what he got. But the question remains the same. BYU outbid everyone for AJ Dybantsa. And that is really tough for Utah, I think, because it just shows that they can dish out that much NIL money for a singular player. Does Utah have NIL resources? Of course they have some. They were able to compensate Cam Rising and several of their other guys. Do they have potentially $7 million worth to get the number 1 player in the country to come? Doesn't seem like it. We haven't seen Utah land anyone close to that caliber. And that's definitely concerning when your rival has better NIL resources than you. And unfortunately, it's a real thing. It doesn't mean that BYU is unbeatable. Doesn't mean that Utah is not going to be able to compete with BYU in all their sports. But unfortunately, BYU could be setting themselves up in a position to be a stronger program simply. And Kalani Sitake's a heck of a head coach, but this doesn't even come down to that. It becomes they'll have access to better players because of the NIL collective than Utah does. And Utah can beat BYU. They obviously have had a lot of success over the past decade. Well, prior decade, obviously, to the last 2 matches been won by BYU. And Utah was right there at BYU. It'll still be a rivalry game. Like, it's going to be neck and neck. But BYU is putting themselves in a position where, because of those NIL resources, they could year in and year out potentially be a better program than Utah, because they more than likely BYU is going to consistently be landing higher level recruits than Utah. And that is definitely concerning and something that's really unfortunate and just tough. And I do think that Utah is still going to land quality guys. They're going to recruit and develop them, but they won't be the types of players that BYU is probably able to land on basketball and football. We're going to see several of these guys in the portal probably go to BYU, right? That's not me coming with saying, I have inside sources that say this is going to happen. But a lot of guys who obviously play football in the state of Utah, they like to stay in the state of Utah, so they'll go to Utah or BYU, bounce back and forth. We've seen that before, right? Francis Bernard, an example of that from a couple of years ago, and he's far from the only example of a Utah and BYU guy ended up switching teams. So yeah, the BYU landing Dybantsa concerning for the basketball court, but honestly, it has football ramifications too, because it just shows you what BYU is capable of NIL wise. And I don't think Utah's not capable of that. They're not. I don't think right now that you have to show Utah has to show they're capable of investing that much into recruiting to show they will be on BYU's level recruiting. Doesn't mean that every year on the field BYU is going to win the game, but it's probably going to be a lot of times moving forward where BYU will be favored because they're going to have the better roster, and because they're recruiting and NIL is better. And when your NIL is better, like I said, NIL is better, your recruiting's better. So you have the better team on paper. And we'll see if Utah's able to overcome that year in and year out. And they might, and Utah's NIL, I mean, they got outbid for for their first 2 offensive coordinators, right? So, and maybe I think there was other stuff, as Alex Markham talked about, that played in with Arbuckle earlier in the week, but the Leftwich sounds like they got outbid for Leftwich. I'm very interested to see how this Utah team performs over the next few years when they're not going to be landing. They always didn't land the best recruits. They survived without that, but there's going to continue to be those gaps in recruiting between Utah and some of the best teams in the Big 12, I think, because of Colorado has NIL resources, BYU clearly does, and I don't know if Utah has those resources. So that's something that's going to be worth monitoring as the offseason continues to go on. But Utah's still going to land quality players. They got their OC hire in place. I'm still high on this Utah team's future, but it's definitely concerning that the best player in all of college basketball, BYU, was able to meet his NIL price, and Utah wasn't even in the room for a guy who does play basketball in the state of Utah. I know he's not from Utah. He moved out here to play basketball in the state for the Utah Preps, I think is the team he plays on. But yeah, something to keep in mind moving forward. Originally, what I wanted to spend a lot of time talking about on this show was all the transfer portal guys, because there were so many guys that ended up entering the portal for Utah. And I think we'll have more time to dive into that on a future episode, but I'll just say this. It is unfortunate that a guy like Cameron Calhoun's caliber is not on this team anymore. It kind of ties into the Dybantsa conversation, right, of NIL. And I'm very curious to see how Utah is able to keep their talent. There are some players that are going to prioritize, Utah's going to compensate their starters, obviously. So they're going to prioritize, I found a home. I'm getting good coaching. I'm going to stay here. Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu seem to be two guys that are doing that, but that won't apply for everyone. So can Utah continue to succeed in this era of college football? Yes, absolutely. Is it going to be tough? Also, yes, absolutely, because your development is going to be even more key if you can't compensate players. We're in pay for play in many ways right now in college sports, and I don't know if Utah can compete with some of the best teams in the country. We'll see. Some guys they'll still land. They landed Spencer Fano. They got a couple good ones, but that's where recruiting and developing just becomes even more important once again. So, yeah, big news all about the portal, recruiting, adding. That's the rage in college sports. Well, Utah did recently get news that one of their tight ends is coming back. And I think he's going to be a breakout star next season. I'm going to tell you about how big it is that Landon King announced he's coming back. We'll talk about that in one moment. But first, today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. FanDuel has you covered as we get ready for the NFL playoff race. It continues to heat up. FanDuel is the place to be. Got great games this weekend. Lions hosting the Buffalo Bills. How about Thursday Night Football, Rams 49ers? Still division implications on the line there. And yeah, not a ton of college football. We got Army, Navy, but NBA, NHL, there's still so much going on at FanDuel. And FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com today to join. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Those of you who follow this show during last offseason know I was a huge fan of Utah's tight end, Landon King. He showed flashes in 2023 of being a dynamic tight end with lackluster quarterback play with Bryson Barnes and Nate Johnson as his quarterbacks. He had 14 catches for 166 yards, 3 touchdowns, and emerged later on as the season wore on. And I thought this last year was going to be a great year for him, paired up with Cam Rising. But unfortunately, he was lost in the shuffle of Utah had a deep tight end room and also just couldn't get him the ball when he was on the field, because he was targeted in several games, but it didn't work out. The most crushing miss I can remember for him was not miss, but Isaac Wilson missing him over the middle of the field against Colorado would have been a monster, like 50-yard touchdown. It was a total coverage bust, and it was just one of those you can't miss that throw, and he did. But King this past year, 3 receptions for 54 yards, really popped late against UCF, had a couple big catches down the stretch of the season, and he's an incredibly athletic tight end. The 6'5", 220-pound junior came over from Auburn to Utah, and I wasn't sure if he was going to stay. I mean, when you think about it, as I said, how Utah kind of I feel like mismanaged him last year, but he was getting open more than Utah was getting him the ball. And that's where I think it was just like, okay, I would have understood if he entered the transfer portal. But he tweeted out, "A Utah man I am," and Landon King is officially staying. And I think he could be good in Jason Beck's offense. The leading tight end for New Mexico was Trace Bucker a year ago, 22 catches for 138 yards overall, so had a couple touchdowns. I think there's reason to believe King can even surpass those numbers. I think King could be the second best pass catcher on this team and maybe even the best. I don't know if he's shown enough to say, oh, he's going to be the best for sure, but I do think he's a special tight end. I really believe if Utah can unlock his abilities and give him the opportunities, he's going to shine. There were videos in fall camp of him beating Smith Snowden in coverage. He is capable of getting open. He's a really good route runner, and he's a really good athlete, too, who's capable of making plays after the catch. He's a mismatch for linebackers who try to guard him, and you got to guard him with safeties or cornerbacks, honestly, more often than not, in my opinion. So I think King is a guy who can lead this tight end room. Losing Carson Ryan was a loss for Utah. It was a substantial loss for sure. So now King is your best tight end in the room, along with Dallin Bentley, who's the other guy. King's not the greatest blocker in the world, but he's continued to work hard, add strength, and he's got grown as a blocker, I feel like, too. And he's absolutely your best pass-catching tight end on the roster with that route-running ability. He's got good hands. His catch against UCF was really impressive, too. So really excited King's going to be back. I think he's going to be a big part of this offense. Obviously, Jason Beck must have sold him on his role, or at least I believe he did, in order for him to return. So that's also incredibly exciting that King is returning, and I think going to be a big part of this passing attack. Utah still needs a number one receiver, but when we start to look at, okay, weapons that maybe Devon Dampier, as we said, is maybe going to commit, going to have throwing at his disposal. Darren Zipper, Zacharias Williams, Landon King, still need to find that number one receiver, which I do think Utah will be able to do, because Utah's number one receiver history, Dorian Singer, Devon Valley, it's proven you can get over 600, over 700 yards at the receiver spots. That's still the thing that holds value in this offense. And now, obviously, it's a new offensive Jason Beck has, and I do think he will be able to sell players on his vision for this team. So that is a solid group. That's a group that's coming together as a pass catcher. Yes, is that banking on improvements from Zipper and Williams? Yeah, but those guys are true freshmen last year, and freshmen usually make a leap from freshman to sophomore year. So I think it's fair to guess they'll improve, and I'm sure Utah will not just add one receiver, but probably a couple of them in the transfer portal too. So I'm starting to like the weapons that Utah's assembling. I'm excited to see this offense that Jason Beck has on full display. We get to see it in the spring game coming up in a couple months. I know it's weird to talk about the spring game, but hey, I'm just excited to see what this offense looks like in that game. Excited to see these guys get the chance to make some plays. And Landon King is a guy that much more past the spring game, but in the fall of 2025, I expect to find his way in the end zone several times. The most catches he's had in a season are 14. I would expect right now, I think he's easily going to get 30 catches next season. That blew up in my face last year, but you give him good quarterback play with his abilities, and I really think it's going to work out for Utah. So incredibly excited to see what King can do, and really hoping that as the time I'm coming to you guys tomorrow from now, there's more players who have announced they're staying, and Utah announced their addition of Devon Dampier. But we don't know how the portal is going to shake out. But how do you guys react to the news? What do you think of everything with Cameron Calhoun? What did you think of BYU landing AJ Dybantsa? What do you think about Landon King staying? And how do you feel like Utah's going to land Devon Dampier? Whatever your thoughts are, drop them in the comments below. Love interacting with you guys down there. Always appreciate you supporting the show. And look, we're not going anywhere. Locked On Utes this offseason. I mean, there is no true offseason in college football right now. There's transfer portal stuff 24/7. I recorded an episode earlier today that is literally old now because of how much and constantly this stuff is changing. So I hope that you guys will join us again tomorrow. Hopefully we're talking about a quarterback edition. If not, tons of portal stuff. We still got to talk about all the guys that are leaving Utah outside of the Calhouns of the world. That'll be coming up on tomorrow's Locked On Utes. Thank you for making us your first listen of the day. If you're in the market for a second listen, Locked On College Football. Also have our Locked On Big 12 Squad show coming out tomorrow. That's always a lot of fun. So make sure you guys keep it at Locked On Utes, and we'll see you tomorrow.